The Guelph Guild of Storytellers and friends are excited to bring to you an eclectic array of stories, stories to mark Canada Day and to honor stories. But first we want to give an acknowledgement about this land. This land we are on is steeped in rich indigenous history. It was the land of the Anishinaabes, the Attawandaron, the Hodeshinones, and they lived in this land, and they took care of this land. And there's still this rich history and the descendants that we honor today. So from all across Turtle Island, we in Guelph and area are home to First Nations people, to Inuit people, to Métis people who continue to share their stories and their rich cultural heritage.
Hey, it's Brad Woods. I'm really thrilled to be here, happy to be here as part of this project. And I was asked how I got into storytelling and how I got connected with the Guelph Storytelling Guild, and which is great. I love talking about this sort of thing. I love talking about storytelling as much as I love telling stories. I think I've always loved stories. My mom was a great reader, still is, and read to me faithfully as a kid, and I just loved to listen to stories. So was her dad, actually, and so I think I kind of think I come from a long line of storytellers in different ways. My grandpa was more theatrical than I was, and my mom was more of a reader. But it's still, at the heart of it, it's still about story. And then when I was in my late 20s, I heard about Storytelling Toronto, this wonderful organization that put on a festival every year. And through a project I was doing at York University at the time, I ended up getting connected with a guy named Dan Yashinsky, who's a bit of a national treasure, Canada, one of Canada's great storytellers. And through Dan, I got involved in the festival, volunteering, and then open mics and that sort of thing. And before I knew it, I was, sort of hanging my shingle and calling myself a storyteller. And here we are some, 22 years later. And it's got to the point where I get invited to places like this to tell you stories. So, and when I moved to Guelph 18 years ago, still just wanting to be connected, knowing that there was a guild. I probably through a Google search, I found you folks and went to a couple sort of the gatherings and open mics and got up and got connected that way. And ever since I've been telling stories at events off and on that the guild has put on, and as well as other places in and around Guelph. So I think just sort of seeking it out, loving to listen is what drew me to stories.
Hi there, James Gordon here. I've been asked to say a few words about my connection to stories and to songs. Stories are everything, as far as I can tell. I firmly believe that we as individuals are nothing more than the stories that we carry with us. And if we are carrying stories from our ancestors and our community, it helps to hold us together and keeps us aware of our past so that we can look forward to the future. I often think as a songwriter that stories are kind of like my raw material. It's like there's this beautiful forest of stories, and I won't clear cut it. I'll chop down a nice story here and there, smooth it out and shape it into a song. And if I've been able to communicate through that song something of myself and something that I've carried forward from listening to that story, then the storyteller and myself, or the song listener, we've made an important connection. And I'm quite aged now and have been at this a long time, and I think that is what keeps me going. The kind of connections that you can make can be thrilling. And I would look at myself as a story collector, story catcher more than anything else. If you meet me, I'll find a sneaky way to draw a story out of you. And if you tell me one, I'll tell you one. And we've made a much more intimate connection than we could. And it makes us graduate to human beings with stories rather than consumers or taxpayers or any statistic that we get attached to. So Stories are for me.
Deogenade young yats, Ganyankahaga, Niiokwaganyatin. So my name in Mohawk is His Bright Fire. And as I said, I'm Mohawk from Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, or Tyendinaga as it's known. And the last piece was my clan, which is the Turtle Clan. I've been raised in white culture, and it was only about 10 years ago that I learned that I had these native ancestors, and have spent the last number of years researching, getting to meet people at Tyendinaga and reconnecting.
So I'm Saya Van Geest, and I'm one of the members of the Storytelling Guild. And Bruce, we appreciate you being here, because what we want to do is hear the Indigenous point of view about the event and about storytelling per se. So here's a question that we have for you. We are marking Canada Day, but it makes us think that we didn't use the word celebrate. And we're wondering, from an Indigenous point of view, what does that mean to mark Canada Day? How does that speak to you? And how can we, in a respectful way, mark Canada Day, keeping in mind the Indigenous perspective?
Marking Canada Day is tricky for Indigenous people. And it's even trickier when you come from two cultures. I mean, I grew up white, and I think I need to preface this with a little story. My dad served with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. He landed in Normandy a week after the invasion began. He drove a Bren gun carrier from Normandy through the lowlands, through the Netherlands, and ended up in Germany in 1945. So when I hear people talking about coming to Canada and celebrating this land, I get it. I know, my dad was part of that liberation, and hearing from particularly the people of the Netherlands about the opportunities they saw in Canada. So I get that aspect. The other flip, of course, is it's as though there was nothing here before 1867, and we were here. And so there's some pain, there's a bit of anger. Without saying too much about the people who run Canada Day in Guelph, it's been hard to get their attention to what is really needed. And for me, what would be needed would be a chance to say, we were here, we have been custodians of the land. Let's use Canada Day as a time to recall the treaties that we signed. Come back to that dish with one spoon. The idea that we're in this together. We're going to share resources. We're going to share the land. We're going to make sure there's enough for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And we're going to keep the spoon in the dish clean. We really need to work on that last piece.
Getting this. My name is Brad Woods. I'm a storyteller here in Guelph, and I just want to say what an honor it is to be doing this with you folks today. I'm always so thrilled when I get asked to do anything with the Guelph Guild of Storytellers. So thank you so much for having me here today. I've been asked to tell a story for Canada Day. Now, this isn't really about Canada per se. But it's a good Canadiana sort of story. And the first time that I was ever in Winnipeg was in the back of an ambulance in the pouring rain. And that is the best beginning to a story I'll probably ever have. I was at a camp up there telling stories and whatnot, and on a day off we went into town to do some banking and pay some bills and that sort of thing. And on the way back out of town, we bought a bag of apples from a local merchant. So we've left town, we're driving along the Trans-Canada Highway, munching away on these apples, when my then 11-month-old son started to choke. Now, this wasn't regular little guy choking. This was like excessive drool and face going purple and eyes rolling back of his head kind of thing. And so I turned the car around and drove frantically through the town looking for the hospital. The drive only took about 3 minutes, but it felt like it took the rest of my life. At that point, it wasn't even raining yet. So I burst through the doors of the Kenora Hospital with my little guy in my arms. I was as nervous and as worried as the day he was born. And they got us into a room and did a bunch of tests and a bunch of x-rays and determined that there was indeed a piece of apple stuck somewhere down in one of the wrong pipes that was preventing him from breathing properly. So now I find myself pacing around the lobby of the Kenora Hospital, drinking vending machine coffee, waiting for a medical team to determine whether or not they're going to operate on his little 11-month-old throat or send him off to the sick kids hospital in Winnipeg where they can deal with these kind of things more appropriately. Next thing I know, I'm climbing into the back of an ambulance with a doctor and a nurse and my 11-month-old son strapped to this hospital bed. He was kicking and screaming and flailing and wailing. It was bad enough that he was choking, but now he felt like he was being tortured. And at this point, it was beginning to rain. Now, as soon as the ambulance started driving, he fell asleep. I don't know if it was the hum of the engine or just the movement of the vehicle. I don't know what it was. But on the one hand, it was nice because it calmed everything down. But on the other hand, it only heightened my anxiety. Because at least when he was screaming, I knew that he was breathing. And so we're driving along the highway there, and they've got the sirens going, and they've got the lights going, and they're going about 120 kilometers an hour, and I'm nervous, and I'm worried, and I'm praying, and my hands are all wet, and my mouth was all dry, and it would have taken an act of God to get me to let go of his fat little hand. Then all of a sudden, the doctor said, "So what brings you to Kenora?" And I said, "Oh, I'm doing some work at one of the camps." He said, "Oh, what kind of work do you do?" And I said, "I'm a storyteller." And they said, "Great!" Now, I think what they meant by great was that I could entertain them, tell them stories. But clearly I wasn't in the mood to be entertaining anyone. As a matter of fact, I think great was probably the last thing that got said on that trip. I just spent the next 2 hours staring at my son, listening to the pouring rain. Now, when they finally got us to the sick kids hospital there in Winnipeg, they sort of fast-tracked us up to the front of the line, probably because he was an infant and they had radioed ahead and all that sort of thing. So they got us into another room and there was more tests and there was more x-rays and there was a lot more waiting. And then all of a sudden I find myself in this hospital room. The scenario is such that I find myself in a hospital room in the middle of the night, and I'm 300 kilometers from where I'm supposed to be and 3,000 kilometers from where I want to be. And, I'm done. It's 12 hours after this whole torturous ordeal has begun, and I'm done. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, I feel completely wasted, just, absolutely spent. So I'm laying there, and all of a sudden, my son opened one eye and then the other. And he looked at me and he smiled. Now, you need to understand something about my son Porter. He's one of these kids with a fat, round, white head. And when he smiled, things change. When he smiles, it's like that first stroke of color on a blank canvas, or like stirring cream into black coffee. And he's staring at me, smiling. And all I can think of saying is, "Are you crazy? Do you know where you are? Do you know what you've been through? Do you know what you put me through?" But he just keeps staring and smiling, like he's trying to tell me something. But he's only 11 months old, so he's got no words. And all I've ever done is listen with my ear, so I don't know how to hear exactly what he's trying to say. And it's frustrating to both of us because he wants me to know something. He's trying to tell me something, and I'm trying to listen, but I can't. And it's getting more and more annoying and more frustrating. And then all of a sudden, it hits me. He's smiling because he's okay. He's smiling because somewhere along the line he either swallowed down or spat up that little piece of apple. And so now he's saying, the show must go on. That we got to get back on the horse and ride. Or perhaps that we need to stop and smell the roses. Or whatever it is they grow there in Winnipeg. He was telling me, as clearly as anybody has ever told me anything, that unless you're hurting, you have to be the one that's helping. Even if that's just by smiling. And so that's what we did for the rest of the night in that hospital room. Just stared at each other and smiled. It's hard to know how to listen. And it's really humbling when you learn it from an 11-month-old boy. Thanks for listening.
Happy Canada Day, everybody. James Gordon here, and I'm going to share with you a couple of Canada Day stories, and I'll finish up with singing you a Canadian-esque song. Canada Day was so popular, there was gigs galore for Canadian musicians that you'd try to squeeze in as many as you could, sometimes 2 or 3 a day on July the 1st. I remember once I was performing at lunchtime in Stouffville, Ontario, doing a kids concert, and I had agreed to do it and agreed to perform in Ottawa with my band at the time, Tamarack, at Rideau Hall for their Canada Day celebrations with the Governor General. And I had it perfectly worked out like a rock star. I had a taxi cab waiting behind the stage in Stouffville to race me to the airport, get me to the plane on time, which would get me to Ottawa just in time to make it for the show. Everything worked perfectly. I got on the plane. We're nearly at Ottawa, and the pilot said, "You know, we forgot something, folks. Because it's Canada Day, it's the Ottawa Air Show. The airport's kind of busy, so we're going to land at the nearest airport until we can get clearance to come back." And we all went, well, I don't know, I guess so. And it turned out the nearest airport that a large plane can land to Ottawa is the same Toronto airport that I had just left. So we turned around, sat on the tarmac for a while, took off again, landed in Ottawa perilously close to the start time for my show, grabbed a cab, did the famous get me to Rideau Hall and step on it. He raced me to what he thought was the entrance. Turns out it was the back entrance, and I could see far off past a huge crowd, way in the distance, a little stage where I could hear my own band playing without me. And I had too many instruments in my hand, but I went racing across the field and just got to the stage as they thanked everybody and played their last song. Another memorable one was really early on in my career. I was playing with a folk band called Maple Sugar, and we had it was real folklore extravaganza with fiddle players, step dancers, a lot of the old timers. And I was about 20 years old. This is in about 1976, I'd say. And we got what we thought was a big break. We were invited to play on one of those Canada Day television specials that took place all over the country. And we were invited to perform in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, as it was known then. Had never been to the Arctic before. It was a pretty exciting adventure. And we got on a plane in Toronto with quite a few bands destined for Inuvik. Our band, I don't know if you remember Shirley Eckhard. She was on the bill. Had some great hits back in the 70s. A French-Canadian band called Cano. Quite a few really fine acts. We stopped in Yellowknife on the way, and we were a little bit disconcerted to see that the CBC film crew got off in Yellowknife, leaving us pretty well by ourselves in the airplane to go the rest of the way, us musicians. Turns out they were wrong getting off there. But it was too late. We got to Inuvik. As soon as we landed, I was the young guy in the band that also seemed to be the organizers. It turned out that no one had told Inuvik that these musicians were coming. It was news to them. They did have a hotel reservation for us. Someone had made, I guess, at the CBC. But there was no concert set up. We just had a room there. And I think it was me and one of the other band members went off and booked the high school auditorium and said, send the bill to the CBC. The principal said, oh, okay. And then Shirley Eckhart and myself went to the CBC radio outlet, which was in Inuvik, and talked the radio folks there into letting us promote the show by interviewing each other. So I interviewed Shirley. She interviewed me about my band, and we announced who was going to come, announced it for 1 o'clock the next afternoon in the high school. And that was all the promotion that we can do. Much to our surprise, we got over and set up. When 1 o'clock came around, there was probably 1,000 people. The whole town showed up. Word spread fast. Someone was bringing them entertainment. And I also remember that it was raining out, and everyone in Inuvik, except us, had a pair of rubber boots, identical ones from the Hudson's Bay store there. And when the show started to gather and people were arriving, there was 1,000 pairs. That would make 2,000 identical rubber boots, because you can't wear your boots on in the gym, for heaven's sakes. So there was a big sea of rubber boots, and somehow at the end of the show, everyone managed to pop their feet into a pair of boots. Don't know if it was the same ones or not. The show was a big success. We had to rustle up primitive sound gear and everything. And there was a party after we organized. And one of the things I remember at the party, great jamming, heard some Arctic musicians as well. We were traveling with a piano player, and there was no piano where we were going to have the party. And one of the partiers was a high school teacher who found a friend with a pickup truck, and they broke into the high school and stole a piano, brought it down the street, hauled it up, threw it in the house, and the party was on its way. This is called Too Canadian these days. So, happy Canada Day once again. See if you feel too Canadian sometimes too. I feel as flat as the Saskatchewan prairie, foggy as a St. John's dawn, cold as a Yukon January. Something's wrong, kind of empty in the middle, far away as Hudson Bay. You know I'm feeling just a little too Canadian these days. I got no goals, got no defenses, like the Toronto Maple Leafs, getting good at riding fences. That's our national disease. Kind of empty in the middle, far away as Hudson Bay. You know I'm feeling just a little too Canadian these days. Well, I do something about it. as a St. John's dawn, cold as a Yukon January. Something's wrong.
Hi, my name is Jenny and I am a member of the Guelph Guild of Storytellers, and I am here to share a story with you. Oh, I see you. I see you watching me out of the corner of your eye as I walk by. These old ears, they hear your whispers of mocking, saying impossible. But it is possible, and it is true. In fact, Edward Albert, Prince of Wales, will graciously confirm to you that I am who you think I might be in this old, wrinkled body, this old, worn body. He'll even tell you that the events of June 22nd, 1813 did happen, that they do matter, and they hold some significance. You know, it's only taken 40 some odd years for me to hear those words of recognition tickle my ears of that amazing, incredible long journey I took so long ago. I am still waiting for compensation and pension for me and my husband and our contribution at that time. I am now an old woman of 80, and I doubt I'll see that in my lifetime. By the time that happens, I'll be buried in the ground next to my husband, finally at rest and at peace. But since you are here and sincere in your interest in my story, I will tell it to you. And I'm going to start by telling you that war and battle bring out the beast in men. It stirs the souls of everyone who it touches, especially the families of those soldiers. I myself am the daughter of Major Thomas Ingersoll of the American Revolution and wife of James Secord, Sergeant of the 1st Lincoln Militia under the direction of Sir Isaac Brock. I have been schooled in the subject of war more deeply and long than I wish. I knew in the late summer of 1812 that the advance of those American soldiers was just a matter of time. I knew it especially after James had told me of the great success that Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh, chief of the Shawnee Nation, had in securing Fort Detroit, for they secured it by surrender. Not a single gun was fired, not a single life was lost. It was a wonderful big win for the British. I knew that that was just the calm before the storm. I knew that that was the breath before the fire would be stoked. War has a way of seeping into everything, to every life. It has a way of, like shadows, blinding you. It pulses in the air. It hangs. It's fear. Fear of the unknown. It is fear of the American soldier. That American soldier who had to fight all of the wilds of this nation, all of the forests, for there were no roads. There were no paths laid before them. They had to fight that before they could fight us, their enemy. And there was no promise of shelter and no promise of food or wages. And that is where the beast of war would feast on their exhaustion. It would feast on their anger, and it would feed their duty. Take what you need. Take what you want to be successful, to complete your duty as a soldier. It wasn't long after the capture of Fort Detroit that I noticed in Queenston, where I'm from, a small trading post, that suddenly there were lots of American soldiers all around, taking, killing, bullying, and then taking some more. Now, my husband fought under Sir Isaac Brock one more time in the Battle of Queenston Heights. It was one of the most gruesome battles. And we lost Sir Isaac Brock. It was a very sad time. But in that battle also, my husband was severely wounded in his leg and in his shoulder. As soon as I heard that news, I fled to his side to bring him home. When I found him, there were 3 American soldiers circling him, their guns raised, ready to beat him as if he was some sort of wild animal that needed to be killed and put out of his misery. "Stop!" I screamed. I placed myself between the soldiers and my husband, laying my hand on James's arm. "Please," I softened my cry, tears in my eyes. "Please, this man is my husband. He is severely wounded. Look at him. He is not going back to battle. He is no threat to you. I've come to take him home, please. We have 5 children. I cannot raise them alone. Please let me bring my husband home. Please. I beg you." A moment later, a man by the name of Captain Wool appeared. And I don't know what happened to those soldiers, but what I do know is that we were able to go and leave and go home. And I also know that Captain White saved our lives that day. And once we got home, all we could find were our 5 children, hungry, anxious, and scared. All we could do was look at our empty cupboards. No food, no supplies. But James was home, and that was the most important thing. So over the next several months, we rebuilt our stores. We finally had food in the cupboard and some things, some supplies, some blankets, and we were able to make James as comfortable as he possibly could be. His wounds, they were deep and they were devastating. So in addition to looking after the children and looking after our home, I now also had to play nurse and look after James's wounds and make sure they were clean and taken care of every single day. Because if I didn't, infection surely would fester and kill James. Bang! 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 The American soldiers were on our doorstep. Bang! 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 I looked at James. I looked at the children. I looked at the door. All I could do was open it. I tried to nod to the children to assure them as much as I could without saying a single word. I stood tall. I swallowed, and with a shaking hand, I opened the door of our home to these soldiers. And they pushed their way through, demanding food and shelter, and sitting at our table as if it was their own, living in our house. One night while I was tucking the children into bed, my heart stopped and my mind raced with images only war could create. I heard the soldiers talking about a plan to attack the British, a plan that would overtake Queenston, a plan that would happen in 2 days. I'm a clever woman, and I am schooled in war, and I learned from my husband and from my father that if this battle was won, if this battle took place, life in Queenston would be far worse and more devastating before it would ever get better. I knew right then, in that moment, I had to go. I had to warn the British. I had to find Fitzgibbons. So, the next morning, I took my shawl and I wrapped it around my shoulders. I went and I kissed my husband and all 5 of my children on their cheeks and foreheads, and I told each one how much I loved them, just in case I didn't return. I softly closed the door behind me as I watched the Americans sleep in my home. I slipped off as quietly as I could. Now the journey, it was far more arduous than I had anticipated. I walked all day and into the early night, through wild forests and brush, trekking through rivers, losing my shoes, avoiding the main roads because American soldiers were everywhere. And I knew from listening to the men who lived in my home, I knew what was in the minds and the hearts of those soldiers. And I knew the beast of war would think nothing of killing a strange woman in the woods who might be a spy, to leave my body there on the dirt floor to feast or feed the insects and the wild animals. No one would know. I would hide behind bushes and trees. And as the evening came on and dusk began to rise, I started to get attacked by mosquitoes. I was covered in sweat and tears, and fear started to wrap around me, thinking that I might not make it, that I may not reach the British in time. Snap! What was that? A twig? And then I heard it, the shuffle of feet along the dirt floor, not of one man, but of many. I stood there like a deer, frozen, watching and listening, wondering who or what was about to come out and attack me. This man, this very, very tall man, stepped out from behind a bush, and the sun, making its final plunge into the skyline behind him, silhouetted him so much I couldn't see his face. But what I could tell is he wasn't a soldier of any sort. He was a warrior, an indigenous warrior. He was young, he was strong, and he had a band of men behind him. I knew this was my last chance, my last opportunity. I had to approach this young man. I locked eyes with him, hoping that he knew some English and hoping that my pleas would be understood. The Americans, they're going to attack. In 2 days, please, take me to the British, take me to Fitzgibbons, please. Time is running out. The young man sized me up, and after a moment he nodded to his men, and he led the way, and before I knew it, we were crossing the threshold of a building where Fitzgibbons was. I was exhausted, and my feet bloody and torn, but I took what strength I had left, and I repeated every single thing I heard what the American soldiers said. I told the British, word for word, everything I heard. And when I was done, they gave me some food and a place to rest. And they took that young man who escorted me to their door, and they all went into another room. I found out later that young man's name was John Tutela. Now, I want you to remember this one thing from my story, if nothing else. The indigenous people of this land, they are brave, they are strong, they are clever, and I believe they are our friends. Now, I know my neighbors may not agree with that and look down upon me as a crazy old woman to say such a thing. But as our friends, we must look out for each other. We must look out for them as they look out for us. We must trust each other, stand next to each other, just as Tecumseh and Brock, Tutela and I. It is the only way that we're going to build a strong and free nation in this wild land that we all live. We must honor the friends we have made in war, because if we don't, we will lose so much more that we have fought for to try and keep. Now, you might look at me and think, she's a crazy old lady. Or perhaps you see me as a wise old woman. Whichever it is, that is up to you, my friend. But this is my story, and yes, I am Laura Secord.
April the 25th is an extremely important, almost a sacred day in both Australia and New Zealand. It is akin to Canada's November the 11th, Remembrance Day. Because while Australia was born in 1901 on the 26th of January when Confederation was declared, it wasn't until 1915, April the 25th, that the country was baptized. Baptized, unfortunately, in blood, because it was on that day that the British command sent the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, to do battle against the Turks along the Dardanelles, Suvla Bay, Gallipoli. They wanted to find out whether a landing force and invasion would be possible from that point. Well, the Australians and New Zealanders, those Anzacs, were slaughtered. Some survived, but many died, and they lay there today. A few years ago, I was able to go to a sunrise service in Madawi on April the 25th, the same service that is held in every town, small centre, city, in both Australia and New Zealand. I arrived with my nephew before the sun rose. As the sky started to lighten, some magpies started to chortle, but Then in the distance we heard the beat of a drum. It started growing louder, and then we could hear the beat of marching feet coming towards us. There was a troop of soldiers, some active soldiers, some long ago soldiers, marching down the street to the cenotaph. And when they assembled, as the sun rose, that sunrise service, as it did all over those two countries, began. Now, Eric Bogle, an Australian songwriter, poet, penned a story, a song, about Gallipoli. I met Eric twice, once over a beer at the Hillside Festival in Guelph, and another backstage after he'd finished a performance at the River Run. And I asked him a favor. Could I use his works to perform? And he said, his words, "Go for it, mate. Have fun with it." Well, I want to do the same favor to you. Actually, I'm going to give you two favors. First, I'm going to reproduce what Eric wrote. And the second favor, perhaps most important of all, while Eric sang it, I won't. And that is a blessing. So here we go. Well, before I do start, a couple of words to remind you of. A Matilda is a swag, a roll. It's a blanket in which a person's entire possessions are rolled, held together by a couple of pieces of rope and slung over their back. They carry it. That's their Matilda. They waltzing their Matilda, they carry their swag, they carry their pack. And that's about it. The quay that's mentioned, of course, is Circular Quay, that ferry and passenger dock that's now nestled between the Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge in Australia. Now you know that. When I was a young man, I carried me pack, and I lived the free life of a rover. From the Murray's green shores to the dusty outback, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Then in 1915, my country said, "Son, there's no time for roaming. There's work to be done." So they gave me a tin hat and gave me a gun, and they marched me off to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as a ship pulled away from the quay, and amidst all the cheers, flag waving and tears, we sailed off to Gallipoli. God, how I remember that terrible day when our blood mixed with sand and with water, and how in that hellhole they called Suvla Bay, we were butchered like lambs to the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was waiting. He'd primed himself well. He showered us with bullets and rained us with shells. And in 10 minutes flat, he'd blown us all to hell, nearly blew us back home to Australia. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury our slain. We buried ours, the Turks buried theirs. Then we started all over again. And for 10 weary weeks, and for those who were left, we tried to survive in that hellhole of death, mud and fire. And for 10 weary weeks, I kept myself alive, while around me the corpses grew higher. Then a big Turkish shell knocked me ass over head, and when I woke up in a hospital bed and seen what had happened, God, I wished I were dead. Never knew there were worse things than dying. For I'll go no more waltzing Matilda, all around the green bush far and free, 'cause to hump tent and pegs, a man needs his legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. So they gathered the crippled, the wounded, the maimed, and they shipped us back home to Australia. The armless, the legless, the blind and the insane, those brave, bloody heroes of Suvla. And when the ship pulled into Circular Quay, I looked at the place where my legs used to be, and thank Christ there was nobody waiting for me to cry and to mourn and to pity. And the bloody band played Waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway. Nobody cheered. They just stood there and stared. and then turned their faces away. And now every April I sit on my porch and I watch the parade walk past before me, and I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, reliving great days and past glory. But the old men march slowly, their bones stiff and sore, proud old heroes from a forgotten war. And young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. That the band played Waltzing Matilda, and those old men still answered the call. But as year followed year, more old men disappeared. Now there's no one to march any more. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, oh, come a waltzing Matilda with me, and their boots may be heard as they march by that billabong. Oh, come a waltzing Matilda with me. Thank you.
So, Bruce, here's another thing we're wondering. We are storytellers, and a lot of the members of the Storytelling Guild are teachers, or at least we share a passion about stories. And some of the most wonderful stories, they're so dynamic, they're so energetic, there's such wisdom in them. And that, of course, is the indigenous stories. And those stories go way back from Turtle Island tradition. So what we want to know is, how can we show appreciation without appropriation?
Appropriation and appreciation are really tricky things. It's like a continuum. So there's no sharp divide, I don't think. I think it's a case of knowing. And the first step is, where did your story come from? How did you acquire it? Was it a story that you heard in a public space, and so there's no specialness to it? It may, no, let me say it a different way. It should have a definite location. If you are told that this is a native story, run away. If somebody says, this is a story from the Chippewas of Nawash, and I heard this from Elder James, then you know it's an authentic story because it has provenance. There's a name associated. And then the question would be, do you have that elder's permission to tell the story? If you can say yes to those, then you're appreciating and you have the right to tell it.
Canada is recognized, and its strength is its multiculturalism, and we celebrate that multiculturalism. Well, that gives Canada this eclectic array of stories, wonderful stories. And the ones that speak most powerfully are indigenous stories, stories that have a history that goes way back in time. And I have a special affinity to African stories for a number of reasons. Well, this is a story, one of those stories. Once upon a time, way back in the midst of beginning time, did you know that there were no stories on earth to tell? Can we even imagine it? No stories to make us laugh, to make us weep, to make us ponder, to make us wonder. No stories to keep family memories or community memories, and no stories to hold back the dark. But there was someone who knew the secret of those stories, and that was a Nancy. And Nancy lived in the rainforest, deep in the rainforest, in what we now call West Africa. Now, Nancy knew the secret. Nancy knew there were stories, but those stories were closed in, locked in a box that sat way up in the sky kingdom, up with Nami. Now, Nancy had another secret. He could spin webs. And so Nancy spun a web ladder up, up to that sky world, and there he presented himself to Nami. "Ah, Nami, I'm a Nancy from the Earth world, and I've come to ask you for a story, just one story, so I can tell my people in my village deep in the rainforest." While the great nobles and ladies who were gathered in that throne room, they started to laugh. They started to giggle and to guffaw and to chortle and I mean, how could an Earthman, so small, so small, so small, how could he pay the price that they knew that Nami would demand for those stories? But Nami held up a hand, and in the silence, Anansi heard what he must do. He must bring her Osibo, the leopard of the terrible teeth. He must bring Mamboro, those hornets who sting, like fire. And he must bring Moesha, the little dancing one that no eyes have ever seen. Well, Anansi bowed, and he said, "Well, we shall see what we shall see." And as he climbed down that ladder, he could hear them, the mocking laughter of those nobles and ladies of the court. Well, you see, what Anansi did not realize, that they had tried. Some had tried more than once. Why, a few had even made it their life's quest to pay that price for stories. Well, Anansi returned to his village, and there he started pacing around and around and around the fire pit, thinking. And then he stopped. "I've got it," he said. "Ha! Vine creepers and a game. Vine creepers and a game." Then he continued pacing. Thinking. And then he stopped. "I've got it," he said. "Ha! A calabash filled with water and a banana leaf. Yes, a banana leaf. A banana leaf and a calabash." But the villagers, they did not ask, because sometimes when Anansi was deep in thought, sometimes he did new things, sometimes startling new things. But Anansi continued pacing. Round and around he went. Dew in that packed earth. "I've got it," he said. "Ha! Yes, a wooden doll covered with sticky latex gum, and a bowl of pounded yams. A bowl of pounded yams." Now Anansi stopped his pacing, and he ate a supper, and then he went to his sleeping hammock, and soon the villagers could hear that soft snoring. Now it was early in the morning, while before owl had even hooted to wake the sun, that Anansi awoke, and he had a big bowl of millet cereal, and then he went into the rainforest, and there he walked to the tree, and there the tree where grew the strongest vine creepers. Now he cut 6 of those lengths, and he slapped them around on his shoulders. And then he went around that big tree, and he carried on further and further into the rainforest until he got to the place where Osibo, the leopard, where they do their hunting. And by, boom, there was the leopard. "Ha, ha, ha, Nancy," said the leopard. "You were just in time to fill this rumbling, hungry belly." Well, as for that, and Nancy swallowed his fear, what for that, what will be, will be. But could we first play the binding game? Now Osibo liked games, so he asked, "How is that played?" "Well," explained Anansi, "you lie down on your back, and I will bind you by the foot with these vine creepers, and then when it's my turn, why, I will lie down and you can bind me by the foot." "Ha, ha, 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 ha," thought that clever Osibo. "When it's my turn, that's when I shall have him fill my hungry belly." And so Osibo lay on his back. Oh my, when those lips curled back, those teeth, whoop, they were sharp. And Anansi bound him by the foot with the vine creepers. And then he stood back and he said, "Ah, thank you, Osibo. You are ready to come with me up to Nami, up to the sky world." And Anansi spun a web around Osibo, and he carried that web back to the great tree, and he hung him on the lowest branches. And then Anansi went into the forest, looking for a banana bush. And he cut a great frond from that banana bush. He went back to the village, and he filled the calabash with water. And then he snuck to the land of the short grass, Sora, till he got to the baobab tree. That's where the hornets have their nests. And then he took that banana leaf and carefully, he put that banana leaf over and above that nest. And then he took the stopper out of the calabash and he poured that water on the leaf. Well, of course it thundered, and it made a lot of noise, and Nancy whispered, Maboro, should you not protect those delicate wings and come into my calabash? And they did. One by one, vroom, 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 all of those hornets flew into that calabash. And Nancy put on the stop, and he said, "Oh, I thank you, Maboro, but you're ready to come with me up to Nami. And he spun a web around that gourd, and he carried it back to the great tree where hung Osibo. Now next, Nancy went to the forest, and he carved the little wooden doll. And then he went to the gum tree, and he covered it with sticky latex gum. And then he went back to the village, and he got a bowl of pounded yams. And then he went to the flamboyant tree where it was said that the little ones did come dancing. Well, he tied a small vine creeper around that little sticky doll baby's neck, and then he hid behind the trunk. And he waited. Whew. Well, the sun traveled across the sky, and the sun went to sleep. And then the moon awoke, but there was no little one that came dancing. And Nancy waited and waited. And then the pre-dawn darkness returned, and then Owl hooted to wake the sun. And just as the sun peeked over the horizon to see what kind of a day it was going to be, there she came. Oh, the little one. She came, dancing, dancing, dancing to the flamboyant tree, and she stopped when she saw the little wooden doll. Little doll, and those pounded yams for me. And Nancy pulled on that vine creeper, and the little wooden doll rocked and rocked as if to say yes, yes. And so the little one ate all those pounded yams. Mwah! And then she smacked her little lips. I thank you, little one. But the little one just sat there. I say, said the little one, when I say thank you, why good manners dictate that you must reply, so I will say it again, thank you. But the little wooden doll just stood there. I will slap your crying place, said the angered little one. And that she did. She took her hand and she slapped that sticky gum baby's cheek. And of course her hand stuck fast. You let go of me or I will slap your other crying place, she said. And she did. She took that hand, she slapped that gum baby's cheek, and of course it stuck fast. And then she butted it and she kicked it. That's when Nancy came out from behind the trunk. Oh, little one, please don't be afraid. But you are ready to come with me up to Nami, up so I can get a story. And that's what he did. He spun a web gently around that little one, and he carried her back to the tree. And then he climbed that web ladder up to the sky world. And he brought into the throne room Osibo the leopard, and Maboro those hornets, and Moesha the little dancing one. Well, can you imagine those nobles and ladies of the court? Their mouths dropped open. Their eyes grew wide. How was it that little earthman was able to pay the price? But Nami again held up a hand, and she said, earthman, you have paid the price, and I will give you the 3 keys, and you may take that box back to the village. Now you will notice that one of the keys is a large key, and I want you to give that key to every elder that's in your village, and they must touch that key and give that lock a little turn, because it's the elders who are the sacred keepers of the story. Now the next key, the middle key, that you will give to the middlers in your village. Those are the mamas and the papas and the aunts and the uncles, because they know the value of the stories. Now that little one, that little key, you must give it to all the little ones in your village, why even the little newborn, and have them touch that lock, because it's the little ones who believe in the magic of the story. And so when Nancy did, he climbed down that ladder, and he brought that box of stories to the village, and it was as she said it would be. And when Nancy opened that box, why, stories came out, and they traveled from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear, until the whole human family was filled with stories. Now, this is a story that I've told. You take it. You must take it. And you give this story away. You give stories away.
Well, hello. This being Canada Day, we have a great story for you, which I hope you'll enjoy. Um, it's a story about Canada and Montreal and the Parliament buildings, which were located in Montreal at the St. Anne's Market. So I'll tell you about that story and what happened, the initial findings, and what's been happening recently, which you may find very interesting. So, hope you enjoy it. Happy Canada Day. In 1837, in 1838, there was an uprising in what was then Canada, which consisted of Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Louis-Joseph Papineau was the leader in Lower Canada, very well-liked man, very respected by the people of Quebec. And in Upper Canada, we had another man, William Lyon Mackenzie. The uprising, which very indirectly by Mackenzie, but very directly by Monsieur Papineau, was to gain total political independence from the British Crown and to create the Republic of Canada. Well, as you can imagine, it didn't happen. The British responded in force, brutal force. And brutal force, I mean, men and women were hanged in public spots. Others were just executed on the spot. In the aftermath, women were rounded up and put on boats and shipped to one part of the world. Men were put on boats and shipped to another part of the world. Children were put on the boats and sent to a third part of the world. The feeling being that if they split up these folks, mostly Francophone, French Canadian, that they would not dare to rise against the British Crown again. Forgetting, of course, that there were a lot of Anglophones, a lot of English who were involved in this uprising, but penalties to them just didn't happen the way it happened to our Francophone brothers and sisters. So it was a brutal put down, and an interesting fact for you to know is that those British soldiers came from what is now Cornwall, Lancaster, Ontario. And I can't remember the name of the battalion, but the battalion still exists today. So another interesting bit for you. So the British responded after the rebellion by creating what they called the Province of Canada. And the Province of Canada would have its own parliament, and the Province of Canada will be divided into Canada East and Canada West. Canada East being what is now Quebec, Canada West being what is now Ontario. And, so the parliament was established. Now, up until 1844, the capital of this British colony called Canada was Kingston, Ontario. Well, Lord Bagot was brought on board to be the Governor General, and he decided that Kingston was just too close to the US-Canada border. And he was afraid that being that close, it could be easily overrun by invading American soldiers. And he felt that if he moved the Parliament buildings to Montreal, he would appease the separatists, the independence feeling in Quebec, as they would see that they were being included in the Canadian experiment, if you wish, and feel good about it. Ulterior motive was that they would see the beauty and the benefit of the British way and give up their Catholic faith and their French language and become British. Well, as you know and I know, that didn't happen. Thank God. In 1845, the Parliament passed what is called the Rebellion Losses Act. And this was a bill to compensate people who had suffered as a result of and directly from the uprisings of 1837 and 1838. So the bill was passed. In its application, though, the benefits were allocated strictly to English people, those who were of English birth, birthright, language, and all the rest of this good stuff. The Francophones were not provided any compensation, even though their farms, their barns were burned to the ground, their crops were burned out, everything that they owned was destroyed. They had nowhere to live. That first winter after the rebellion was a pretty tough winter with a lot of these people living with no home. But the Francophone, did not receive any compensation, forgetting the fact that Mackenzie had led a whole lot of Anglophones, English-speaking people, in this uprising. But the British elite decided that it was strictly a Francophone uprising and they should pay the price. And so they were not compensated. So it wasn't very fair. In 1848, an interesting thing happened. Up until 1848, while we had a parliament in what was then Canada, it was controlled by the majority English. Mostly English loyal to the British Crown. And these English made sure that laws were passed that gave prominence to the British Crown and the English language and the English culture and the Protestant religion. And this was fact. This went on. Well, in 1848, a weird and strange thing happened. The Francophone got out and voted. And enough of them got out and voted that they voted in a Francophone parliament. Well, you can imagine how this went over. Lord Elgin, who had been appointed Governor General by the British Queen, had said that no matter what, he would abide by the wishes of the Canadian Parliament. And here we see the beginning of the independence of the Canadian Parliament from their British overlords in London, England. And he stood by that. So the election showed a majority government of Francophones. And he supported that. And he said, if this is the wish of the people, so be it. Well, you can bet the Anglophones, the Tories, were furious. For the first time in their life and their history in Canada, they had lost control. They had lost majority control. They were furious. So while they lost control of the Parliament, they did not lose control of the British Army. And these Tories started to have private meetings where they did not include any Francophones. But the Parliament had been won, and Parliament was put together at that time in 1848 by a majority of Francophone members, elected members, and Parliament resumed. So things went on. They did their daily business, and they passed laws, taxation laws, laws related to land ownership, boundaries, and this sort of thing. On April 29th, 1849, introduced into the Canadian Parliament in Montreal was a new Rebellion Losses Act. Now, this act was almost identical to the original one, but it included direct compensation to the Francophone population. Well, the Tories were furious. The Anglophone, loyal to England, were furious at French people who they said mounted an uprising and supported an independent Canada should be compensated, forgetting, of course, that there were a lot of Anglophones involved with this uprising. They were not happy. So on the day that the bill was passed, Lord Elgin signed the bill into law, promptly left the Parliament buildings, got into his carriage, and rode off into the night. As his carriage left the Parliament buildings in St. Anne's Market, he was pelted with stones and cow manure, sheep manure, but he kept going. Nobody really stopped him. Once he was out of Montreal and back on his estate, the British Army surrounded him and protected him. Meanwhile, back at the Parliament buildings, the Speaker of the House was conducting business as is normal, and for some reason, Lord Elgin, who was responsible for security of the Parliament buildings, had only left 2 unarmed guards at the doors of the Parliament buildings. And the doors were left wide open. All the windows of the Parliament building were opened, wide open. Total access to the buildings. Well, a mob developed. And the parliamentarians sitting in the building could hear the mob outside. And what was all this commotion? A man burst into the parliament buildings and boldly screamed out, "I declare this parliament closed." And he picked up the royal mace and he threw it on the ground and shattered it. At the same time, other demonstrators opened up the pipelines providing gas to the building for heat and lighting and set it on fire. Other demonstrators threw torches through the open windows, which set the curtains on fire. And so the fire began, and the building at the aftermath burned to the ground. What was lost in that fire was approximately 23,000 volumes of books on Canadian history and the people in Canada at that time. Government archives. It was terrible, terrible fire. The building burned to the ground. There was an inquiry afterwards, because remember, the riot went on for a couple of days. There was an inquiry, and it was found that the rioters were Francophone people upset with Parliament, and that they were to blame. And eventually, the Queen of England, I think it was Victoria, moved the Parliament buildings to Ottawa. And this was after a period of time when the Parliament buildings rotated between Quebec City and Toronto. But the British Queen decided they should be in Ottawa, and so the current Parliament buildings were built in Ottawa, and so be it. The aftermath. This is interesting. The aftermath of the fire. A couple of things have been discovered. Number one, based on history, written history from the Grey Nuns who had their major nunnery home across the street from the Parliament buildings, have detailed, in direct detail, quotes, that the people involved with the uprising were not Francophone. They were English, many of them English soldiers who the nuns had witnessed taking off their uniforms and putting on clothing to resemble the Francophone, speaking perfect English, but during the rebellion, during the actual attack on the riot on the Parliament building, spoke French. Well documented by the Grey Nuns. So thank you for the Grey Nuns. I mentioned to you all of the books that were destroyed. Terrible, terrible stuff. Nobody was ever convicted for this uprising. Now, here's an interesting bit. In 2017, there was some work going on in Montreal in the old, St. Anne's Market District. And guess what they found? They found the original floor floor supports of the Parliament buildings. They found volumes of books which had been charred, some not burned completely. Other things that they found, the original stamp of the Parliament of Canada. There were 2 stamps found of the original Parliament in perfect order. They found half-eaten cans of food. They found pipes. They found notebooks. It was just a treasure trove of artifacts from that fire. And so it has been declared by the federal government and the Quebec government to be a National Historic Site. And slowly, to this day, people are slowly going through all of the remaining debris of these Parliament buildings, which spread over 106 acres, and finding so much about our early history, and working on retrieving the semi-burned books and notes from various parliamentarians at the time. So, while we study history, it is always good to remember what are the true facts behind the story. When I learned about Canadian history, I learned about how the French had burned the Parliament buildings in Montreal to the ground in an uprising against the British Crown, when in fact this did not happen. So I hope you enjoyed this story about our early Canadian history, and take care. Again, happy Canada.
Hello, my name is Don Conabear, and I'm here on behalf of the Guelph Guild of Storytellers to tell you my story called Puffins. So it's no secret I love a road trip. Summertime in Canada means getting out a paper map and finding a far-flung destination. You might be heading off to a family member who lives in Saskatchewan. You might be off to see historic sites in Quebec. You might be off to a provincial park like Algonquin. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is you get out and you go. And almost invariably, every time we go on a road trip, the memory of that trip that gets talked about for years to come is not the destination itself. It's some event that happened along the way, some discovery that you made that you didn't even know was there to be discovered until you left for home. And I'm going to tell you about the story about one of those times. So the year was 2004. My family was camping in Terra Nova National Park in Newfoundland. And we decided to go out for a little day trip just to see what there is to see. So there's my wife and I, 3 kids, 8 to 13 years old in the back, and we're exploring a little secondary highway along the coastline. And we come up to a sign and it says Puffin Festival ahead. Well, awesome. My daughter, the youngest one, had been talking about puffin since before we had left. She actually had a little toque with a puffin knit into the front. So we get a little closer, and there it is, the Puffin Festival. Well, the Puffin Festival in Newfoundland, while it might be a big event there, isn't much bigger than a little fair that you might find in a mall parking lot here in Ontario. But regardless, we're driving by and I see a fellow who's just parked his car, and now he's waiting for me to drive by so he can cross the road, go to the Puffin Festival. Great. I ask him, I stop. In Newfoundland, you stop on the road, nobody cares. And I say, excuse me, I see there's a Puffin Festival going on. I assume that must mean there's puffins around here. Can you point me toward the puffins? My daughter's really excited to see puffins. He says, no problem at all, follow me. Turns around, he gets back in his car, pulls out on the highway, and now I'm following him down the road. Don't even know his name, just a nice guy willing to give his tourist a hand. So after about 5 minutes, there's a bend in the road, there's a spot on the shoulder that we can pull over, and that's what we do. And he says, if you walk out this path here, you're going to come to a point of land, and just off the shoreline there's an island. It's like a chimney rock, and there you're going to find puffins. Well, great, thank you very much. He heads his way, and we unload the kids and we start walking down this path. And at the beginning, this path is probably wide enough you could drive a car down it. Great. So we're walking along, nice and relaxed. And then as we get closer to the shoreline, I'm starting to hear the crashing waves. We are next to the Atlantic Ocean, and the wind's up, I guess, and the water is just pounding on the rocks. And the path starts getting narrower and narrower. And then there's a moment, because we're on a little peninsula, where we got ocean on both sides of us, probably a 30-foot drop on either side onto the rocks. And the pathway has gone from wide enough to drive your car on to not much wider than a city sidewalk. So you can imagine, we got 3 young children. My wife and I were staring at each other going, what have we gotten ourselves into? But it's probably safer to continue than it is to try to turn around on this skinny little piece of path we found ourselves on. So we grabbed the kids on tight. We kind of tiptoe forward. We hope nobody from Children's Aid is watching, otherwise we'd have some explaining to do when we got home. And we get to the end of the little peninsula where it kind of opens up. It's kind of been a keyhole shape. We've passed the most narrow part, and now there's a circular area, maybe 30 feet across at the end, where it's grassy, and we tell the kids, sit down, don't move. And we hang on tight. And there, straight ahead of us, across maybe about a 40-foot gap, there's like a chimney rock. It's a little island, and it's come straight out of the ocean. It's probably 50, 60 feet tall, and it's covered in puffins. There's puffin nests on the side, there's puffins diving in the ocean, there's puffins swimming in the ocean, puffins eating, puffins fighting, puffins doing all those things that puffins do. By the hundreds and maybe thousands, I don't even know. And loud, it was drowned out the ocean. It was absolutely fantastic. And as a visitor to this wonderful little piece of our country, I really felt like one of those rare moments where you just get you're experiencing nature in such an intimate form that, you know, and that very few people ever get to experience. And it was absolutely fantastic. And everybody was just transfixed watching the activity. And after a few minutes, a couple of the puffins came over to where we were, landed on our piece of land, check us out. And I'm there as a dad, not wanting to let go of my kid's hand, but wanting to capture the moment. So I quickly grab my camera out of my pocket and snap a picture. Not the best picture I've ever taken, but probably one of the best memories I've ever captured, of a couple of puffins 10, 15 feet away checking us out. So after 15, 20 minutes, we realized we've been truly blessed. Let's not push our luck. Kids might get restless, whatever. So we stand up, grab tight on the kids again, single file, tiptoe across our way down back along the path. Not much wider than the city sidewalk with the ocean on both sides. And we get back to the car. And getting back to the car, I kind of had that feeling like after a really long swim and you're tired, but you finally get to touch bottom again. You go, okay, I'm going to be okay. It was that kind of feeling. But if I could tell you, if you were to ask me, Don, what is there to see in Newfoundland? What was your favorite part? I'm going to tell you about some little funny black birds, white birds, black and white, with these little orange beaks. And what a truly wonderful experience we had discovering where they live. And you're going to say to me, what? I'm going to drive how many hours in a car to go see these birds? I might stay at home. You'd be missing out. Because it's these accidental discoveries that do become the memory of the trip that my kids still talk about years later. So, when this time of isolation is over that we're all in, what I'm going to be doing is getting out the big paper map of Canada and my pen and picking some place that I've never been before and planning my next road trip. And I know somewhere along the way, I'm going to have an adventure, make a discovery, create a memory that's going to last me a lifetime that I didn't even know was there to be found when I left. And I encourage you to do the same. Thank you for listening to my story.
My name is Denise Francis, and I am the president of the Guelph Black Heritage Society.
My name is Marva Wisdom.
Yes, my name is John Leacock, and I should say my name is John Wesley Leacock. My mom named me after one of the founders of the Methodist Church in England, which was John Wesley.
So I grew up in Guelph. I went to elementary school, high school, university here. And it wasn't until when I was on campus in the 90s that I even heard about this building, the British Methodist Episcopal Church. And at that time, I actually started attending services here. They had a minister who was from St. Vincent, and she used to hold services here on a Sunday afternoon. So, as John mentioned, we've been friends since I came on campus in the 90s. And at that time, I was an avid Facebook user. And he put out a post about how he had seen that this building had been up for sale. And I saw the post, and I gave him a call. And I said, what can we do to try and save this building?
Knowing that the church was in an R1B zoning, which is a residential zoning, I know it would have opened up a can of worms in terms of investors looking to buy this property and making it into a home or a stylized institutional use other than what it was, which was a destination and a place of fellowship for descendants of the Underground Railroad who lived in this Essex Street neighborhood. I was like, my God, we gotta have an impromptu strategy, right, to get this place into our names. That was the plan from the get-go. So I got on the phone and I started making phone calls.
2010, and I got a call from Big John, and Big John called, and I remember him saying, Sister Marva, I have something to talk to you about. At the time, I was chairing the United Way campaign, and it was my second time chairing the campaign. I was winding down and getting ready to complete the campaign, and he shared with me about this building that is on the MLS listing, and thought the work that I'm doing with United Way, I could transfer those skills and work with the community in trying to buy this building.
Jim Livingston, Jonathan Ball, Andrew Craig, there was a lot of people that were around that I knew. At the time, Andrew was busy a lot with the radio CBC, but we knew that. We also called on Kevin Sutton, who did a beautiful video that was at that time got huge following on social media. He did a short video on YouTube talking about what was taking place. So it created that activism that brought energy, and it went national. So by it going national radio and TV, we ended up having phone calls. So I had pro bono lawyers calling in that willing to provide their services and gave some good perspective. And a guy by the name of, a lawyer by the name of Charles Davison that represented us on some of the aspects of the initial acquisition and forming of the organization. We were able to work with the church, and Reverend Skyers, I think his name was, and Bob Lucas was a religious realtor on the other end, and the late Peter Ellis, who was a broker of record here in Guelph, who was also helpful in listening to us. We had to travel to other BME churches to finally come on, I think it was a November day in 2011, to sort of bring this together as accepted offer over 40 other offers.
The next sort of big hurdle, once we actually got the building, was to become a charitable organization, because that opened up so many doors for us in terms of fundraising, grant proposals, and so on. I would say this year, in terms of what I would find monumental, is we received 3 big grants. And so we received funding from the Enabling Accessibility Fund, Ontario Trillium Foundation, and Canadian Heritage. And so it's always been my dream that this building would be accessible, and it hasn't been. There's so many people now that can't come to our programs or just enjoy the space in general, simply because they can't even get in the building. And so it's been a long haul. Since 2012, we started thinking, how can we make this building accessible? And we finally realized our dream this year.
Hi, I'm Bev Matson, and I'm a member of the Guelph Guild of Storytellers, and I would like to tell you a personal story. My mother was an incredible seamstress. She designed her own clothes, and she could draft patterns so that she could make them to fit. She made my clothes as well, and when she became a grandmother, she started to making clothes for my daughter Elizabeth. Unfortunately, she died when Elizabeth was barely 2, and she left me all sorts of bits and pieces of material to be made into dresses. Now, although she was a perfectly wonderful sewer, I was not. There was no need. But now I had to put these little dresses together. Mother had always said, waste not, want not. And we really needed those little dresses for Elizabeth because we didn't have much money in the early days of our marriage. I called upon a friend, and she came over, and together we managed to figure out how to put them together, and before Elizabeth outgrew them. But I had a surprise when I went to clear out my mother's closet, because in the back of the closet I found a finished dress for Elizabeth. It was adorable. It was a red and white stripe, and it had full skirt, puff sleeves, and a little white collar. The only problem was it was a size 5, and my daughter was barely 2. She would have to grow into it. I hung it in her closet, and when she got older, I told her the story of how her Nana had made her that dress when she was just a baby. Elizabeth could hardly wait to grow into it. Each year she would try it on, but she was always too small. But finally, one day arrived when she was big enough to wear it. And of course she wanted to wear it everywhere. I allowed her to wear it to church to begin with. And eventually I gave in and let her wear it to school. And finally it became a play dress. And then the day came when she outgrew it. The waist was too tight. The seams were beginning to split, especially under the arms. And I decided that, Elizabeth, I think it's time to retire this dress. No, Mama, she said. It's a special dress that my Nana made me when I was just a baby. You're always saying we should recycle things, so you turn it into something else, okay? What could I do but try? I looked at it and decided, well, if I took the top off and put elastic around the waist, let out the hem, it could be a skirt she could put in the dress-up box. Elizabeth was delighted, and it turned into many a creative character. But eventually it too began to look a little sad. I think, Elizabeth, that it's time now to retire it. No, Mummy, she said. It's my special dress that my Nana made me when I was just a baby. You can turn it into something else. I know you can. Oh, my. Well, Mother always said, necessity is the mother of invention. And so I sat down and took a good look at the skirt. There were still some good pieces in it. I decided if I could cut little squares and reverse the stripes, I could make a rather interesting tablecloth for her to use when she had tea parties. At first, she loved it. And as things happened, things got spilled on the tablecloth, and eventually it too needed to be recycled. Mama, I think you can turn it into something else. Oh, I don't know about that, Elizabeth. Well, I have an idea. If you made it a little smaller, I could use it as a coverlet for my baby buggy. That's a good idea, Elizabeth. And so I cut out the bad pieces and sewed the good ones together, and it became a coverlet for her baby buggy. But eventually it got kind of stained, and some of the bad pieces got too big to really be of any use or be attractive. Elizabeth, it's time to recycle it. No, Mama, she said. It's a special dress my Nana made me when I was a baby. You turn it into something else. I don't know what to turn it into, I said. Well, she said, you know, Mama, I don't play with my baby dolls anymore. I really prefer to play with my Barbie doll. You could make a dress for my Barbie doll from the scraps. Well, by that time I had learned to sew. So I managed to turn a dress that looked like the original special dress for the Barbie. Oh, she was delighted. She played with it and undressed that doll and dressed that doll and undressed it on and on until finally there was hardly anything left of it. Elizabeth, it really is time to retire this thing. No, Mama. You can turn it into something else. I know you can. Well, I looked at it. There wasn't much left. Just bits and pieces of frayed fabric. But as I played with it, I came up with the idea that I could turn it into a flower. And so I did. I sewed a safety pin to it, and she pinned it to her dresses, to her jackets, to her coats. She even pinned it to her hairband and wore it in her hair. But one day, the safety pin came loose, and the flower disappeared. Oh, Mommy, she said, I know you can't make something from nothing. And she was inconsolable. Elizabeth, you don't have to forget about that dress. The memory of it can live in a story because there's just enough to make a story. Really? We can call it the story of the special dress. Oh, thank you, Mama. And so, that is the story of the special dress. And when Elizabeth grew up, she became a storyteller.
There was a mother who had a new baby, and she picked it up and rocked it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that baby grew. It grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. It grew until it was 2 years old. It took all the plates out from underneath the table. It threw glasses across the room. It picked up its mother's watch and flushed it down the toilet. The mother said, this kid is driving me crazy. But at nighttime, when that 2-year-old was asleep, the mother picked it up and rocked it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that 2-year-old, it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. It grew until it was 7 years old, and it never wanted to come in for dinner, and it never wanted to clean up its room. And when Grandma came and said bad words at the dinner table, sometimes the mother would say, this kid is driving me crazy. But at nighttime, when that 7-year-old was asleep, the mother picked him up and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that 7-year-old, he grew and grew and grew. He grew until he was a teenager. And he never wanted to clean up his room, and he never wanted to come in on time, and he was always on the phone all the time. Sometimes the mother would say, this kid is driving me crazy. But at nighttime, when that teenager was asleep, the mother went over to his bed and she hugged him and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that kid, he grew until he was a grown-up man. He left home, moved into a house all the way on the other side of town. But sometimes on dark nights, the mother would drive across town. She'd get out of her car, climb up to his bedroom window, climb in, pick them up and rock him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that son got older and older. One day he got a phone call from his mom. His mom said, you better come see me because I'm very old and sick. So the son drove all the way across town, walked into his mother's bedroom, and the mother said, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. But she was too old and sick to sing the song. The son picked her up and rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my mommy you'll be. The son went home. He stood for a long time at the top of the stairs. Then he went into the bedroom where his very new baby daughter was sleeping. He looked at that little girl and he picked her up and rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. The end.
Well, thank you for joining us for this special event. Collecting and broadcasting stories online is a new experience for the Guelph Guild of Storytellers, but a reflection of our times. I hope you've enjoyed the experience. I'd like to say a special thanks to our special guests, Brad Woods, James Gordon, and the famous Robert Munsch. We really appreciate you participating in this event. If you'd like to learn more about the Guelph Guild of Storytellers, please visit us at our website, guelphstorytellers.com, or also our Facebook page. You can support the work of the Guelph Guild of Storytellers by attending one of our events, coming to tell a story, or financial contributions to support our efforts are always welcome. You can learn more about these opportunities on our website. So thank you again, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Bye.